50 acres of prime timberland. A rustic cabin sold for pennies. Everyone in town said the property was cursed, haunted by its bloody past. They were wrong. It wasn't ghosts keeping people away. It was a deadly secret, a hidden trapdoor, and $20 million in untraceable gold. The gavel slammed down, echoing through the cavernous, damp hall of the Clallam County Courthouse. Simon Hayes exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for 6 months. Beside him, Nora Fleming squeezed his hand so hard her knuckles turned white. They had just spent $42,000, every single cent of their combined savings, plus a high-interest loan, on a tax-defaulted property, unseen by anyone but the local tax assessor in over 3 decades. It was a 50-acre plot of dense, suffocating Douglas firs in the Hoh River Valley of Washington state. At the center of it sat the Montgomery cabin. As they approached the clerk's desk to sign the transfer papers, Harrison Miller, a county clerk with a face weathered like old leather, slid the documents across the counter. He didn't offer a congratulatory smile. Instead, he peered at them over his wire-rimmed glasses with a look of genuine pity. "You folks aren't from around here, are you?" Harrison asked, his voice a low gravel rumble. "Chicago, originally," Simon replied, signing his name on the dotted line. "But we've been looking for a flip project in the Pacific Northwest. The timber value alone covers our investment." Harrison shook his head slowly. "Nobody from Port Angeles or Forks would touch that land. Elias Montgomery built that cabin in the 70s. He went out into those woods in the winter of 1993 and never came out. Since then, 3 different buyers have tried to live there. None lasted more than a month. They say the woods scream at night. They say the cabin shifts on its foundation like it's breathing. It's a cursed patch of dirt, son." Nora, ever the pragmatist, offered a polite but dismissive smile. "We aren't afraid of ghosts, Mr. Miller. We're afraid of bankruptcy." 2 days later, Simon and Nora stood in the relentless, misty rain of the Olympic Peninsula, staring at their new investment. Calling it a cabin was a generous understatement. It was a sprawling 2-story structure of blackened logs, half swallowed by overgrown ferns and creeping moss. The roof sagged under the weight of decades of accumulated pine needles. The windows were either boarded up or shattered, staring out into the gloomy forest like hollow eyes. The atmosphere was immediately oppressive. The forest was entirely too quiet. No birds sang, and the wind seemed to die the moment it reached the clearing. They set up a temporary camp in the main living room, dragging in portable generators, sleeping bags, and space heaters. The plan was simple: spend a month stabilizing the structure, clearing the rot, and prepping the land for timber cruisers before flipping it to a commercial developer. But almost immediately, the property began to live up to its reputation. On the 3rd night, the noises began. Simon awoke at 2 a.m. to a rhythmic, heavy thudding beneath the floorboards. It sounded like a massive heartbeat, deep within the earth. Nora heard it too, clutching her flashlight. When they investigated the crawl space outside, they found nothing but undisturbed mud and spiderwebs. The next evening, Nora found their heavy toolkit, which she had explicitly left on the kitchen counter, sitting in the middle of the overgrown front porch. The heavy deadbolt on the front door was still locked from the inside. "Someone is messing with us," Nora said, her voice tight with anxiety as she stared out into the tree line, where the shadows seemed to stretch and contort. Squatters, or locals trying to scare the city kids away. Simon refused to be intimidated. He doubled down on the work, focusing his energy on the cabin's kitchen, which was dominated by a massive rusted cast-iron wood stove. It was an antique monstrosity, weighing at least 600 pounds, bolted into a thick slate hearth. By the end of their second week, the paranoia had set in. They both felt watched. The feeling of eyes bearing down on them from the dark woods was relentless. Simon decided the only way to retain his sanity was to tear down the old. He took a sledgehammer to the kitchen's rotting subfloor, intent on removing the rusted stove to lay new support joists. It took 3 hydraulic car jacks and a heavy-duty winch strapped to a support beam just to lift the iron beast an inch off the ground. As the stove shifted with a metallic shriek, the slate hearth beneath it cracked and gave way, revealing that it wasn't solid stone. It was a facade. Underneath the slate were heavy, reinforced steel plates, bolted directly into the foundation. "Nora!" Simon called out, his voice hoarse. He dropped the crowbar. "Bring the halogen lamp, now!" Nora hurried in, aiming the bright yellow light at the floor. Beneath the dust and rust of the lifted stove, set perfectly flush with the steel plating, was a heavy iron ring. A trapdoor. "Harrison didn't say anything about a basement," Nora whispered, staring at the ring. Simon grabbed the crowbar, wedging it beneath the edge of the steel plate. Because he didn't know. Nobody knew. This stove has been sitting on top of this door for 30 years. With a grunt of exertion, Simon threw his weight against the iron bar. The steel door gave a horrific, grinding screech, the sound of metal that hadn't moved in a generation. A rush of stale, ice-cold air blasted up into their faces, carrying the distinct scent of gun oil, mildew, and earth. They pointed the halogen lamp down into the abyss. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a concrete shaft lined with a heavy steel ladder, descending deep into the dark. Whatever ghosts were haunting the Montgomery cabin, they had just found their grave. Simon went first, a heavy maglite clamped between his teeth, his boots echoing sharply against the metal rungs. Nora followed close behind, her heart hammering against her ribs. The shaft was at least 15 feet deep, entirely encased in thick, poured concrete. This was not a root cellar. This was a bomb shelter. At the bottom of the ladder, they stepped onto a dry, concrete floor. The beam of Simon's flashlight swept through the pitch-black space, illuminating a room roughly 20 feet by 20 feet. Along the left wall were heavy-duty metal shelving units lined with military surplus gear. Rusted cans of survival rations, heavy plastic water barrels, and crates of ammunition stamped with dates from the late 1980s. Elias Montgomery hadn't just been a hermit. He had been a doomsday prepper, waiting for the end of the world. But it was the center of the room that made Simon drop his flashlight. It clattered against the concrete, the beam rolling to illuminate a cluster of heavy, olive-green canvas duffel bags and thick wooden crates. "Nora," Simon breathed, picking up the light and stepping closer. The wooden crates were secured with heavy iron padlocks, but time and dampness had rotted the wood. One of the crates had split open at the side. Through the splintered gap, a dull, heavy yellow gleam caught the light. Nora knelt in the dust, pulling a heavy crowbar from her belt. With a sharp crack, she pried the decaying lid off the crate. They both stopped breathing. Stacked in perfect, immaculate rows were gold bars. They weren't standard Hollywood bricks, but smaller, heavy 1-kilogram ingots, stamped with European refinery marks. Nora reached out with trembling fingers, touching the cold, smooth metal. She tried to lift one. It was incredibly dense, weighing over 2 pounds. There were at least 50 bars in this crate alone. And there were 6 crates. Frantically, Simon unzipped one of the canvas duffel bags. It was filled to the brim with velvet pouches. He emptied one onto the concrete floor. A cascade of gold coins, South African Krugerrands, Canadian maple leafs, and American gold eagles spilled out, ringing musically against the stone. "Simon," Nora whispered, tears welling in her eyes, a mixture of pure shock and absolute terror. This is millions. Tens of millions." "It's Elias's fortune," Simon said, his mind racing, trying to calculate the sheer impossibility of what they were seeing. "They said he was an eccentric miner, that he made a fortune in Alaska in the 70s before coming down here. Nobody knew what he did with the money." Nora stood up, her eyes wide. "Simon, we can't tell anyone. If the county finds out, they'll seize it. The IRS, the state, long-lost relatives, they'll take all of it." "We bought the property," Simon argued, though his voice was shaking. "We bought everything on it. It's buried treasure, Simon. The government doesn't care about property laws when there's $20 million sitting on a table. We need a lawyer. No, we need a secure way to move this." As the panic of sudden, unimaginable wealth washed over them, Simon's flashlight beam caught a piece of yellowed paper tacked to a wooden support beam near the crates. He walked over, peeling the brittle paper from the wood. It was a letter, written in erratic, blocky handwriting. "If you are reading this, I am dead." Or they finally caught me. The Dalton family knows. They have always known. I built this vault to hide my life's work from Victor Dalton's father, and now Victor is hunting me. The noises in the woods aren't spirits. They are his hounds. They are his men, trying to drive me out. I am leaving tonight to lead them away from the gold. If you found this, run. They never stop watching the land. The moment they realize the cabin has been breached, they will come for you. Elias M. A chill far colder than the bunker air settled over Simon's spine. He looked at Nora, who had read the note over his shoulder. Her face was entirely drained of color. The haunted cabin, the footsteps, the missing tools, the screaming in the woods. It was never a ghost story. It was a siege. Suddenly, a heavy mechanical thud resonated from above them. Simon killed the flashlight instantly, plunging the bunker into absolute darkness. He clamped a hand over Nora's mouth. They stood in the pitch black, their breathing loud in their own ears. From 15 feet above, inside the kitchen of the cabin, came the unmistakable sound of heavy, muddy boots walking across the wooden floorboards. "They're here," a deep, smooth voice echoed down the metal shaft. The voice did not belong to a squatter or a teenager playing a prank. It was calm, authoritative, and dripping with menace. "The lock on the front gate was cut. The truck is out back." Another voice, gruff and rough, replied, "Think they found the floorboard, Mr. Dalton? If they haven't—" "About to," the smooth voice, Victor Dalton, replied. "Start tearing up the floors, and if you find the new owners, bury them in the woods. The property falls back to the county, and we buy it at the next auction, just like we planned." In the suffocating dark of the underground vault, surrounded by more wealth than they could spend in a lifetime, Simon and Nora realized they had walked directly into a 30-year-old blood feud, and the only way out was back up that ladder. The darkness of the vault pressed against Simon and Nora like a suffocating blanket. Every creak of the floorboards above sent spikes of adrenaline through their veins. Dust drifted down from the ceiling as heavy boots stomped across the kitchen, pausing directly over the steel trapdoor. Simon held Nora tight against the cold concrete wall, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. they were entirely defenseless. "Mr. Dalton," the gruff voice called out, the sound muffled by the thick steel plates separating the two levels. "The old stove. Somebody dragged it clear across the kitchen. The slate underneath is completely busted open." A suffocating silence followed. Then the slow, methodical scraping of debris being kicked aside. "Well, well," Victor Dalton murmured, his voice now crisp and chillingly clear as he stood directly over the hidden entrance. "Elias, you paranoid old badger. You actually built it. Bring the acetylene torch from the truck, Cooper. If they locked it from the inside, we'll cut our way through the hinges." Nora squeezed Simon's arm, her fingernails biting into his skin. She pointed a trembling finger toward the back of the vault. In the pitch black, they could see absolutely nothing, but her instincts were screaming. Simon remembered the military-grade ventilation pipe they had seen near the ceiling on the far wall. A prepper like Elias Montgomery wouldn't have built a bomb shelter with only a single point of entry. It was a fundamental rule of survival engineering. Always have a back door. Moving with agonizing slowness, Simon clicked his maglite onto the lowest possible setting, shielding the beam with his fingers so only a thin sliver of yellow light pierced the gloom. He swept the beam across the back wall. Behind a towering stack of rotting canvas tents and rusted water purifiers, there was a heavy, rusted steel grate bolted into the concrete. It was barely 2 feet wide, caked in decades of grime and spiderwebs, but it led outward, away from the cabin. "There," Simon mouthed, killing the light instantly. Above them, the brutal, deafening roar of an industrial acetylene torch ignited. Sparks began to shower down through the minuscule gaps in the steel trapdoor, illuminating the shaft in flashing bursts of harsh, blinding blue light. The air inside the vault immediately began to heat up, filled with the acrid stench of burning metal and ozone. They had less than 5 minutes before Dalton and his men breached the vault. Simon scrambled over the wooden crates of gold, ignoring the staggering wealth beneath his knees. He reached the steel grate. The bolts were rusted solid. He desperately felt around his belt for the crowbar Nora had used earlier. He gripped the cold iron, wedging the curved edge under the corner of the grate, and pulled with every ounce of strength in his shoulders. The grate groaned, a terrible, high-pitched metallic whine that seemed deafening in the enclosed space. "Stop!" Dalton commanded from above, the torch cutting off instantly. "Did you hear that? They're down there. Hey, you folks listening? This doesn't have to get messy. Open the hatch, walk away, and you can keep whatever's in your pockets. I just want my family's property back." Nora grabbed the crowbar with Simon, adding her weight. They didn't bother being quiet anymore. With a violent, sapping crunch, the rusted bolts sheared off, and the heavy grate crashed onto the concrete floor. A rush of damp, earthy air hit their faces. It was a corrugated steel drainage pipe, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through on their stomach. "Go, go!" Simon whispered fiercely, practically pushing Nora into the narrow, claustrophobic tunnel. Above them, the trapdoor suddenly gave way with a massive crash. The steel plate slammed against the concrete wall of the shaft. Flashlight beams instantly sliced down into the vault, sweeping violently across the room. "They're making a run for it!" Cooper yelled, his boots already clanging down the metal ladder. Simon dove headfirst into the drainage pipe just as a deafening gunshot rang out. A heavy-caliber bullet shattered the concrete wall inches from his boots, showering his legs with sharp, stinging debris. He dragged himself forward, ignoring the burning scrape of the corrugated steel against his elbows and knees. The tunnel angled slightly upward, smelling of wet clay and decaying leaves. Behind him, The vault erupted into chaos. Cooper had reached the floor. "Boss!" he shouted, his voice echoing up the pipe. "You need to see this. It's here. It's all here." There was a heavy thud as Victor Dalton landed on the concrete floor. For an agonizingly long moment, the pursuit stopped. The intoxicating, paralyzing sight of $20 million in untraceable gold bars had momentarily stalled their executioners. "Leave them," Dalton's voice echoed, cold and intoxicated by the sight of the treasure. "The pipe heads toward the river bluff. It's a dead end. Get the winch set up. We are loading this gold into the truck tonight. If they survive the woods, we'll hunt them down tomorrow." Simon and Nora didn't stop crawling. Their lungs burned, their hands were scraped bloody, and claustrophobia threatened to suffocate them with every inch they dragged themselves forward. The pipe seemed endless, a terrifying black vein running beneath the haunted earth of the Ho River Valley. Finally, after what felt like hours of agonizing progress, Nora gasped. "Air. I feel rain." 10 feet ahead, the pipe ended in a thick tangle of blackberry brambles and overgrown ferns. Nora pushed frantically through the thorny vines, tearing her clothes and skin until she tumbled out onto the muddy, rain-slicked embankment of a steep ravine. Simon collapsed next to her, chest heaving, the icy Washington rain woking them to the bone. They had survived the vault, but they were miles from civilization, stranded in the freezing wilderness, hunted by armed men who were currently stealing their fortune. The midnight rain was relentless, washing away the dirt and blood from their hands as they huddled beneath the massive roots of a fallen cedar tree. Simon checked his phone. No service. They were entirely cut off. "We run," Nora said, her teeth chattering uncontrollably from the freezing downpour. "We follow the ravine to the main logging road. It's an 8-mile hike, but we can flag down a logging truck by dawn. We go straight to the state police." Simon stared back toward the direction of the cabin. A terrifying, reckless idea was forming in his mind. He shook his head slowly. By dawn, they'll be gone. Victor Dalton isn't going to leave a paper trail. He'll take the gold, burn the cabin to the ground to destroy the vault, and disappear. We'll just be 2 hysterical city kids babbling about buried treasure. "Simon, they have guns. They will kill us." "They aren't looking for us right now," Simon replied, his eyes narrowing in the darkness. "Dalton said it himself. They are focused on loading the gold. Do you know how long it takes to haul 1,000 pounds of gold up a 15-foot ladder using a manual winch? Hours. They are distracted, and they left their truck running out back." Nora stared at him, horrified. "You want to steal their truck?" "No," Simon said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I want to bury them." They moved like shadows through the dense, unforgiving forest, doubling back toward the Montgomery property. The fear that had paralyzed them in the vault was replaced by a cold, desperate adrenaline. They knew this land better than Dalton's crew. They had spent 2 weeks memorizing every ditch, every fallen log, and every blind spot. As they crept to the edge of the clearing, the cabin came into view. The front door was wide open, blazing with the harsh white light of halogen work lamps. Dalton's men had backed a heavy-duty, unmarked box truck right up to the front porch. The engine was idling, a low, steady rumble over the sound of the rain. Through the front windows, Simon could see the operation. Cooper and another large man were operating a heavy tripod winch they had bolted to the kitchen floor over the trapdoor. They were slowly cranking a heavy canvas bag up from the depths of the vault. Victor Dalton was nowhere to be seen, likely down in the bunker, coordinating the load. "They're using our heavy chains," Nora whispered, recognizing the thick steel logging chains she had purchased the week prior. "Exactly," Simon murmured. "Here is the play. I am going to sneak around to the driver's side of that box truck. When I hit the horn, they are going to panic and run outside to see who's trying to steal their ride. The moment they clear that doorway, you sprint in and hit the release clutch on the winch. Let the chain drop. Then you close the trapdoor. Simon, that steel plate weighs 300 pounds. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug, Nora. You can do this. Once the door drops, you throw the deadbolt on the heavy iron latch. It locks from the outside. Elias built it to keep people out, but it works just as well to keep them in." Nora swallowed hard, nodding once. Simon slipped away into the rain, circling wide around the back of the cabin. He kept low, crawling through the mud until he reached the rear tires of the idling box truck. He could hear Cooper grunting with exertion on the porch, complaining about the sheer weight of the gold. Taking a deep breath, Simon scrambled up into the cab of the truck. The keys were in the ignition. He didn't hesitate. He slammed the heel of his hand against the center of the steering wheel. The heavy air horn blasted through the quiet forest, an absolute deafening roar that shattered the night. "Hey!" Cooper shouted from inside the cabin. "Someone's in the truck! Get out there!" Footsteps pounded across the wooden floorboards and out onto the porch. Two armed men rushed blindly into the pouring rain, raising their flashlights toward the cab. In that split second of distraction, Nora moved. She sprinted from the tree line, darting through the open back door of the cabin. She hit the kitchen floor, sliding, grabbing the heavy release lever on the tripod winch. She yanked it backward with all her might. The gears disengaged with a violent mechanical scream. A heavy canvas bag, filled with 200 pounds of solid gold, plummeted down the concrete shaft. A horrifying wet crunch echoed from below, followed instantly by a blood-curdling scream from Victor Dalton. The gold had landed directly on him. Nora didn't wait to look. She kicked the heavy steel tripod out of the way. It crashed to the floor. She grabbed the edge of the massive, 300-pound steel trapdoor. Fueled by absolute terror and survival instinct, she threw her entire body weight forward. The hinges shrieked. The massive steel plate slammed shut over the hole with a concussive boom that shook the entire cabin. Before the men outside even realized what had happened, Nora shoved the heavy, rusted iron locking bar across the top of the hatch, sliding the thick steel pin perfectly into the locking mechanism. The vault was sealed. Victor Dalton and his millions were permanently entombed beneath the floorboards. Outside, Simon threw the box truck into gear, popping the clutch. The heavy vehicle lurched forward, slamming violently into the men on the porch, knocking them backward into the mud. Simon slammed the brakes, threw open the passenger door, and screamed, "Nora, now!" Nora sprinted out the front door, leaping off the porch and diving head-first into the cab of the truck. Simon floored the accelerator. The massive dual tires spun wildly in the mud before catching traction, tearing down the overgrown driveway and smashing through the heavy iron front gates of the property. Behind them, the two gunmen scrambled to their feet, firing wildly into the dark. Bullets shattered the side mirrors and thudded heavily into the reinforced cargo box, but the truck was already vanishing into the blackness of the logging road. Simon drove for an hour, pushing the truck to its absolute limits, until they finally burst out of the tree line and hit the paved surface of Highway 101. Only then did he pull over to the shoulder. He killed the engine. The only sound was the rain hammering against the roof and their own ragged, exhausted breathing. Nora reached over and opened the glove compartment. A heavy black satellite phone tumbled out, alongside a leather-bound ledger. She opened the book. The pages were filled with names, offshore bank routing numbers, and detailed records of illegal logging operations, drug trafficking routes, and money laundering schemes. Victor Dalton wasn't just a rogue treasure hunter. He was the head of a massive organized crime syndicate operating out of Seattle, and they had just stolen his entire operation manual. Simon picked up the satellite phone. It had a full signal. He dialed 911, asking to be connected directly to the FBI field office in Seattle. The aftermath was a media sensation. Federal agents descended on the Montgomery cabin by dawn. They found the two gunmen trying desperately to pry the trapdoor open with a crowbar. Inside the vault, Victor Dalton was found alive, though heavily sedated by shock, trapped beneath a fortune he could never spend. The gold, totaling precisely $22 million, was seized by the federal government. But Simon and Nora didn't walk away empty-handed. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, their instrumental role in bringing down the Dalton syndicate, combined with their legal ownership of the property, entitled them to a massive whistleblower and finder's fee. 3 months later, Simon and Nora sat in a high-rise office in downtown Chicago, signing the final paperwork for a federal wire transfer of $3.4 million. They had lost the haunted cabin in the woods, but they had won the war. And as they walked out into the busy city streets, leaving the ghosts of the Hoh River Valley far behind them, they knew they would never look at a rusty old wood stove the same way ever again. If you loved this crazy real-life